We start now with the United States, which has reiterated its stand and advised India and China to engage in direct dialogue, free of any coercive aspects, to reduce the tension. India and China are engaged in an ongoing military standoff in the Doklam area at the trijunction of India, Bhutan and China border. Soldiers from both countries are locked face-to-face in an area claimed by Bhutan. On Friday, Donald Trump administration urged both the countries to engage in dialogue to reduce tension. US also said that the United States was closely and carefully following the border standoff. Beijing has used psychological warfare against New Delhi to threaten war. Also, the Xi Jinping administration has threatened to meddle in Kashmir through its media outlets. Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping met briefly on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Germany, but Beijing has put conditions on talks and asked New Delhi to pull its troops back before any meaningful dialogue. Almost all neighbors of China have accused Beijing of coercive tactics to settle the border disputes. India's strong stand against China's unilateral action has rattled the dragon. That is the story we are tracking. The Pentagon, in a latest report, they're encouraging India and China to engage in direct dialogue, which is free of any quote-unquote coercive aspects. Over the past 1 week, the US State Department has been making similar statements, but Pentagon now has sought direct dialogue between India and China, where it talks of reducing tension free of any coercive aspects. In the past few years, almost all of the Chinese neighbors have been accusing Beijing of coercive tactics to settle all border disputes. In fact, the month-long India-China border standoff in Sikkim sector is being seen as part of the same kind of coercive tactics to change the status quo. In fact, joining me on the show this evening is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He's a professor and dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs, also the executive director of the Center for Global Governance and Policy. Thanks so much, Dr. Chaulia, for speaking to us. How do you see this statement coming out from Pentagon now? Do you see this more of a message to China rather than India?
Yeah, I think the United States has been hardening its position towards China under the Trump administration, month by month, week by week, day by day. And I'm not surprised to see them call for not just direct negotiations between India and China, but the Americans are now saying, do not use coercive tactics. I think that is clearly aimed at China, because over the last 1 month, the Chinese have been demanding that we should withdraw our forces from Doklam, and two, also issuing all kinds of scary threats about full-scale war and so on. So I think the Americans are essentially indirectly messaging the Chinese and signaling to them to back off a bit and to extend the hand of dialogue, which we have always wanted, direct bilateral dialogue. So I think the Chinese have been acting a little pricey, saying, no talks until the Indians withdraw first. What the Americans are saying is drop those conditions about withdrawal, first talk to the Indians. So I see this as a relatively positive signal coming from the Americans, given the backdrop of the trade fallout that they're having with China, as well as the larger disappointment that the Trump administration has had with China over North Korea and so on. So I think overall the picture is transforming. There was a rosy initial notion that Trump might be able to work out some kind of a G2 or a group of two arrangement with China to rule the world through division of labor and spaces.
Right.
But I think that's not happening, and there is a clash of interest between China and the United States. And whenever India and China are at loggerheads, the United States inevitably will look more positively towards the Indian position. Irrespective of the facts on the ground, I think overall geopolitically, they cannot afford to antagonize India, but they want to meet the Chinese in order to extract.
Got your point. Dr. Chaulia, also, we've been talking about this. The same kind of messages have been coming out from the US State Department, but what the Pentagon really talks about over here is direct talks between India and China to resolve this dispute at the earliest. Now, how do you see that statement wherein the US is calling for direct talks between India and China? We also have India's NSA Ajit Doval, who will be traveling to Beijing for the BRICS summit. Do you think, some sort of resolution may come out of that visit, perhaps a meeting and, breakthrough?
Well, our NSA and Yang Jiechi on the Chinese side, senior official, have been involved in multiple rounds of border talks. And I think what's coming up is important, although there have been some reports claiming that the Chinese don't want to have any talks and that Ajit Doval is only going for the BRICS dialogue and not for the bilateral issues. But nonetheless, the US saying that we must have direct talks with China is important in the sense that, again, in a way they are reminding the Chinese of their own position, which they generally prefer whenever they have disputes with other countries, which is to have bilateral dialogue. The Chinese say they want that when it comes to South China Sea with Vietnam or the Philippines or Malaysia or Brunei, but when it comes to our border, they are saying that no talks first, you should withdraw. I think, therefore, in a way, the Americans are saying, stick by your own principles. Similarly, in the South China Sea, the US has been trying to push the Chinese to say, do not use coercion. So again, they are using the same language here. And if you recall the context of the Modi-Trump meeting and the joint statement that came out, clearly there was a reference to freedom of navigation and adherence to international law and non-coercive, non-threatening behavior. So I think, in a way, it's all directed at them, and it also challenges the Chinese, because the Chinese have been claiming that they are sending out diplomats all over the world to explain how they are on the right and India is on the wrong.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm glad that you brought out that point. When we talk about coercive tactics and the issue of the South China Sea, almost all of China's neighbors have witnessed firsthand what the Chinese do and what they're capable of doing. Dr. Chaulia, just wait with us just a few moments. Also reminding our viewers how the Chinese government's mouthpiece, Global Times, just on Friday stated that if Doklam trijunction issue is not resolved, then China will be forced to use non-diplomatic measures to resolve the situation. That editorial also stating that India's position will force China to prepare for military confrontation. The editorial discusses further, goes on to accuse India's Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj of lying in Parliament. And it states that China cannot lose an inch of Chinese territory, and directly blamed rising nationalist sentiment in India for flawed policies towards China and Pakistan. It says that PLA can reverse any imbalance on any part of the Chinese border in a single day. Dr. Chaulia, China there being its usual belligerent self, what do you make of these hard-hitting editorial pieces that come out in the mouthpiece of the Chinese government, so to speak, the Global Times? Because we're also hearing of efforts on the diplomatic front which India and China are moving ahead with and trying to resolve this in a peaceful manner. But then what does this indicate? Do you actually believe this is the Chinese government's official stand? Or does it indicate that?
They use the Global Times to try and create a good cop, bad cop situation. They say that it's not necessarily the official word of the foreign ministry, but it represents the Communist Party's thinking. So on the other hand, the foreign ministry will say, okay, maybe there is room for bargaining or negotiations when Ajit Doval might be proposition like this. So I think it's a routine that they play, and they use it often to also vent some of the more hardline positions within the Chinese Communist Party. So, but nonetheless, we should not disregard these threats, because they are quite capable of launching limited military actions all along some parts of the line of actual control, and we must be very, very vigilant and alert on a defensive sense on this point. But I think by ratcheting up pressure and claiming that India is whipping up nationalism, they're also, in a way, trying to create the notion, the spread, support the notion that, legitimate claim belongs to China, and India is simply being, encroaching upon Chinese territory. So I think it's also important that they respond to their domestic constituents, and we must understand this. The party Congress, the 19th Party Congress, is coming up, and that's going to decide the leadership for the next 5 to 10 years in China.
That's right.
And they want to show triumph after triumph and no setback. That is the notion of the Maoist notion of progress, which is only one way forward and no stepping backwards. So I think they want to use this Doklam episode to show that we are not bowing to the Indians, rather we will triumph, and therefore the Indians will be forced to eat humble pie. And this is all part of that choreography coming out of Global Times.
Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your perspective here on WION with our viewers.